50,000 Muslims stood against 200,000 Romans, and by nightfall the Byzantine army had ceased to exist. This was the Battle of Yarmouk, the decisive clash that would shape the future of the Levant. The fate of the region hung in the balance, and the Muslims were outnumbered 4-1. The Roman army, confident in their numerical superiority, had positioned themselves strategically, believing that their vast numbers would overwhelm the Muslim forces. But the Muslims, under the command of the brilliant Abu Ubayda ibn al-Jarrah, had other plans. The stakes were immense. The Roman Empire, with its vast resources and military might, was a formidable foe. If the Muslims were to fail, the momentum of their conquests would be halted, and the future of the Islamic State would be uncertain. The Muslims had to win, and they had to win decisively. The fate of the Ummah rested on the outcome of this battle. The Roman army, under the command of Vahan, had positioned themselves in a strong defensive position. They had chosen the plain of Yarmouk, a strategic location that allowed them to leverage their numerical superiority. The Muslims, on the other hand, were outnumbered and outmatched in terms of equipment and training. But they had something that the Romans did not: the guidance of Allah and the leadership of Abu Ubayda ibn al-Jarrah. Abu Ubayda, a close companion of the Prophet, peace be upon him, was known for his wisdom, his piety, and his military acumen. He had fought alongside the Prophet, peace be upon him, in many battles, and had been entrusted with the comm. In the aftermath of the siege of Damascus, Abu Ubayda ibn al-Jarrah reached a moment that history records as decisive. He had already negotiated on the field, yet now the political reality of the conquest demanded something harder than fighting. According to Al-Tabari, when Ḥumar ibn al-Khattab set out towards Syria, Abu Ubayda met him with an understanding that could not be delayed. And when the caliph arrived, Al-Tabari and Ibn al-Athir both describe how Ḥumar listened, asked, and then weighed what lay beyond the walls. Not honor in slogans, but safety for the Muslims, security for the people, and fidelity to the covenant. If Abu Ubayda failed in that hour, if he treated conquest as mere triumph and disregarded the fragile condition of the city, then Damascus might have remained a wound rather than a blessing. Supplies could have collapsed. The soldiers could have been compelled to fight with insufficient strength. And most dangerously, the terms of amity could have been broken, turning the victory of siege into endless attrition. The risk was not only military, it was moral. For the Sunni historians do not preserve the deeds of the conquerors as empty feats. They preserve them to show how tawakkul, restraint, and justice were practiced when success tempted men to forget Allah. Damascus was not a distant rumor. It was a major center whose fall carried consequences for all Syria. After the fighting around it, Abu Ubayda trusted among the commanders for steadiness had to decide what to do with a city whose people, wealth, and population could not simply be treated as trophies. Ibn al-Athir notes that after the siege, the commanders faced the reality of governance as much as war. The city had to be held, its affairs settled, and the terms clarified. Al-Tabari also records that the approach to Damascus did not end with a final clash, because the conqueror's burden began precisely when the gates opened and the dust settled. The armies had already moved into the Syrian order of things, routes, fortresses, and the long lines of contact between districts. Abu Ubayda understood the geography in a way that appears again and again in the narratives of the early conquests. He knew that Syria's strength lay in its cities, and its cities depended on predictable arrangements provisions, tax obligations, and protection under a covenant. The valleys and roads were not empty between battles. They were the arteries of the Muslim advance. In the command structure, Abu Ubayda acted with a particular restraint that later historians highlight as a virtue. He did not treat every negotiation as a defeat, nor every delay as weakness. Al-Tabari depicts the practical need to bring Damascus under stable administration, because a city that could not be trusted to settle peacefully would demand constant garrisoning and repeated fighting. Ibn Kathir, in his account of these events, also emphasizes the seriousness of settling affairs properly after the conquest, because the Muslims were not only tasked with taking land, but with fulfilling the rights tied to that land. But what made this moment especially tense was that the siege did not conclude in a vacuum. Damascus sat amid territories where Byzantine authority had been challenged, and where rival commanders could regroup. The Muslim commanders were not fighting only walls, they were fighting the expectation that the other side would return. That is why Ḥumar, Ibn al-Khattab's arrival mattered. Al-Tabari records the movement of the Caliph towards Syria and the pressure on decisions that affected the whole region. Ibn al-Athir similarly conveys that once the Caliph arrived, the leadership needed to ensure that what was done in Damascus would be consistent with the Caliph's policy toward the conquered peoples and the Muslim troops. Here the question becomes personal. Why did Abu Ubayda persuade Ḥumar to accept a hard peace rather than chase glory? The answer lies in the immediate conditions the historians point to. The Muslims were winning, but they were not omnipotent. Their number and distance made it impossible to treat every outcome as a clean victory. Al-Tabari's narrative includes the theme stressed across reports that the Caliph's authority was not merely symbolic. It was meant to bring order and limit reckless action. When Ḥumar arrived, he was not looking for conquest narratives. He was looking for right governance, for protection of the army and the frontier, and for ensuring that agreements made in Syria did not become a future grievance. Ibn al-Athir, in turn, records the caution surrounding arrangements after major conquests. When Abu Ubayda urged a settled covenant, the reasoning was not cowardice. It was strategic and religious at once. A peace could be hard, because it required discipline-honoring obligations, collecting what had been agreed upon, and preventing the chaos that would come from renewed war before the Muslims were ready to sustain it. To see the rising tension, you must picture what the siege had created. Damascus was conquered, but not emptied. People remained farmers, merchants, laborers, and those who had lived under Byzantine rule. The Muslim army needed resources, yet they could not live only by force. The cities settled, economy mattered. The covenant mattered. A broken covenant would not only endanger Damascus, it would endanger Muslim reputation across Syria. Now we reach the crisis, where history shows the human weight of leadership. Ibn Kathir relates these events with a tone of sober transmission. The Caliph's presence meant that the commanders' actions would be judged not by the noise of the moment, but by the outcomes. According to Al-Tabari, Ḥumar's arrival came with questioning of the situation, an insistence on clarity and accountability. Ibn al-Athir notes the same atmosphere. The Caliph's concern was how to ensure that the Muslims were not drawn into a cycle of battles that could exhaust them. At this point, doubt has a shape even in the chronicles. Not doubt about Allah's aid, but doubt about timing. The temptation in every conquest is to demand immediate finality. The temptation is to push onward, to treat every negotiation as weakness, and to gamble the lives of the troops on a continuation of fighting. But Abu Ubayda's challenge was to speak convincingly to Ḥumar, someone whose resolve was known, whose faith was severe against injustice, and whose patience was not passive but controlled. Al-Tabari's account preserves the idea that leadership in the early Ummah operated through consultation and reason, not mere command. Abu Ubayda did not silence questions. He answered them with the logic of protection. In that consultation, the negotiation over Damascus represents the hard peace itself, a choice that avoided immediate destruction while securing the city's future. Abu Ubaida's persuasion rested on a Sunni measure of success, maintaining Muslim strength for what was coming, honoring the rights of people who had entered into covenant, and keeping the frontier stable enough that later operations could be sustained. The resolution, what the historians convey without exaggeration, was that Umar accepted the outcome as fitting to the circumstances. The caliph's policy favored stability and lawful governance. Al-Tabari records the caliph's movement and the resulting consolidation of authority in Syria. Ibn al-Athir presents the same events as part of the caliph's larger plan: order after conquest and restraint in the face of uncertain odds. In Ibn Kathir's summary, the significance is clear. The conquest was not complete until administration was made just and agreements were honored. What made the persuasion effective is the Islamic character Abu Ubayda displayed, as later narrators understood it. He treated the caliph's role with respect, and he treated the covenant with seriousness. His strategy was not only tactical, it was moral. In Sunni historiography, the hero path is not measured solely by battlefield brilliance. It is measured by the ability to choose what is best for the Ummah, even if it is harder than shouting for glory. The strategic payoff became visible in the way the Muslim position endured. A stable Damascus under covenant reduced the need for constant fighting in the city's vicinity. It allowed Muslim attention to shift from immediate siege labor to wider consolidation. Al-Tabari's chronicle repeatedly connects success to the organization of affairs after battles, showing that victory is sustained by governance. Ibn al-Athir likewise links the post-siege period to the maintenance of order. Because the enemy does not vanish after a city falls, they regroup when given weakness. And yet the chapter cannot end with comfort, because the early conquests were never free of looming threats. The next episode, therefore, will not ask merely whether the Muslims could win a battle. It will ask whether their wisdom in making peace would protect them when a new storm rose beyond the horizon. Because in the chronicles of the early Ummah, stability is always challenged by the world's insistence on renewal. The year is 634 CA. The city of Buṣrā, nestled in the heart of Syria, is under siege. The Muslim army, led by the great commander Abu Ubayda ibn al-Jarrah, has surrounded the city with a force of 4,000 men. Inside, the Byzantine garrison, bolstered by local Arab allies, numbers around 10,000. The stakes are high, and the outcome hangs in the balance. As Al-Tabari recorded in his Tariq, the Muslims had been fighting for days, their siege engines battering the walls, their archers raining arrows down on the defenders. The city was on the brink of collapse, but the Byzantines were not ready to surrender. They had one last gambit, a desperate plan to turn the tide of the battle. The Byzantines, under the command of a seasoned general, had been watching the Muslim lines carefully. They had noticed a weakness, a slight gap in the siege lines that they could exploit. With a sudden burst of energy, they launched a surprise counterattack, pouring out of the city gates and catching the Muslims off guard. The battle for Buṣrā had reached its climax, and the fate of the city hung in the balance. Abu Ubayda, radiyallahu anhu, was a man of deep faith and unwavering resolve. He had been chosen by the Prophet, peace be upon him, to lead the conquest of Syria, a task that required not just military skill, but also wisdom, patience, and a deep understanding of the people and the land. As the Byzantine counterattack surged forward, Abu Ubayda did not panic. Instead, he quickly assessed the situation, his mind racing as he considered his options. He knew that his men were tired, their supplies running low. A full-scale battle at this moment could be disastrous. But he also knew that retreat was not an option. The Muslims had come to Buṣrā to liberate it from Byzantine rule, and they would not be deterred by a single setback. Abu Ubayda made his decision. He would not engage the Byzantines in open battle. Instead, he would use the terrain to his advantage, drawing the enemy into a trap. As Ibn al-Athir notes in Al-Kamil, Abu Ubayda ordered his men to fall back, feigning retreat. The Byzantines, seeing the Muslims in disarray, pressed their advantage, pouring out of the city and giving chase. But Abu Ubayda had a plan. He had chosen the battlefield carefully, and now he would use it to his advantage. The Muslims retreated to a narrow valley, the walls of which were lined with hidden archers. As the Byzantines pursued them, the archers opened fire, raining arrows down on the enemy from both sides. The Byzantines, caught off guard, were thrown into confusion. Their lines broke, and their advance faltered. Seeing their advantage slipping away, the Byzantine commander ordered a retreat, but it was too late. The Muslims, emboldened by their success, pressed their attack, driving the Byzantines back into the city. As the battle raged on, Abu Ubayda faced a moment of real difficulty. The Byzantines, despite their setback, were not ready to give up. They had one last card to play, a secret weapon that they hoped would turn the tide of the battle. As Al-Tabari recorded, the Byzantines had a group of elite warriors, men who were said to be invincible in battle. These warriors, known as the Immortal Guard, were the Byzantine Empire's last line of defense. If they could be defeated, the city would fall. But if they could not, the Muslims would be forced to retreat, their dreams of conquest shattered. Abu Ubayda, radiyallahu anhu, was a man of deep faith, and he knew that Allah was with him. He had faced impossible odds before, and he had always emerged victorious. But this time, the stakes were higher than ever. The fate of Buṣrā, and with it the future of the Muslim conquest of Syria, hung in the balance. Abu Ubayda paused, his mind racing as he considered his options. He knew that a direct confrontation with the Immortal Guard would be suicidal. But he also knew that retreat was not an option. He had to find a way to defeat the enemy without engaging them in open battle. As Ibn al-Athir recorded in Al-Kamil, Abu Ubayda turned to his men, his voice steady and calm. "Brothers in faith," he said, "we have come to Buṣrā to liberate it from the tyranny of the Byzantines. We have fought long and hard, and we have faced many challenges. But now we face our greatest test. The Byzantines have a secret weapon, a group of elite warriors who are said to be invincible in battle. But we are Muslims, and we have the strength of our faith. We will not be defeated. We will not retreat. We will fight, and we will emerge victorious." With these words, Abu Ubayda rallied his men, their spirits lifted by his unwavering resolve. He then turned to his commanders, outlining his plan. He would not engage the Immortal Guard in open battle. Instead, he would use the terrain to his advantage, drawing the enemy into a trap. He ordered his men to retreat, feigning weakness and fear. The Byzantines, seeing their advantage, pressed their attack, pouring out of the city and giving chase. But Abu Ubayda had a plan. He had chosen the battlefield carefully, and now he would use it to his advantage. The Muslims retreated to a narrow valley, the walls of which were lined with hidden archers. As the Byzantines pursued them, the archers opened fire, raining arrows down on the enemy from both sides. The Byzantines, caught off guard, were thrown into confusion. Their lines broke, and their advance faltered. Seeing their advantage slipping away, the Byzantine commander ordered a retreat, but it was too late. The Muslims, emboldened by their success, pressed their attack, driving the Byzantines back into the city. But the battle was not over yet. The Immortal Guard, seeing their comrades in retreat, launched a desperate counterattack, their swords flashing as they cut down all who stood in their way. The Muslims, despite their initial success, were pushed back, their lines beginning to break. Abu Ubayda, seeing the danger, knew that he had to act quickly. He turned to his men, his voice steady and calm. "Brothers in faith," he said, "we have come this far, and we will not be defeated now. We will stand firm, and we will emerge victorious. For Allah is with us, and he will never forsake us." With these words, Abu Ubayda rallied his men, their spirits lifted by his unwavering resolve. He then turned to his commanders, outlining his plan. He would not engage the Immortal Guard in open battle. Instead, he would use the terrain to his advantage, drawing the enemy into a trap. He ordered his men to fall back, feigning retreat. The Immortal Guard, seeing their advantage, pressed their attack, pouring out of the city and giving chase. But Abu Ubayda had a plan. He had chosen the battlefield carefully, and now he would use it to his advantage. The Muslims retreated to a narrow valley, the walls of which were lined with hidden archers. As the Immortal Guard pursued them, the archers opened fire, raining arrows down on the enemy from both sides. The Immortal Guard, caught off guard, were thrown into confusion. Their lines broke, and their advance faltered. Seeing their advantage slipping away, the Immortal Guard commander ordered a retreat, but it was too late. The Muslims, emboldened by their success, pressed their attack, driving the Immortal Guard back into the city. The battle for Buṣrā was over. The Byzantines, their secret weapon defeated, were forced to surrender. The city was liberated, and the Muslims emerged victorious. But the victory was not just military. It was a testament to the faith and resolve of Abu Ubayda and his men, who had faced impossible odds and emerged triumphant. As Ibn al-Athir recorded, the Muslims in their victory showed mercy and compassion, treating the defeated Byzantines with kindness and respect. They did not seek revenge, but instead offered forgiveness and reconciliation. This was the true spirit of Islam, and it was a spirit that would guide the Muslims in their conquests to come. But the victory at Buṣrā was just the beginning. The Muslims, under the leadership of Abu Ubayda, would go on to conquer the rest of Syria, their faith and resolve unshaken. And as they marched forward, they would carry with them the lessons of Buṣrā, a testament to the power of faith and the strength of the human spirit. The Muslim army had won a decisive victory, but the war was far from over. The Byzantines, despite their defeat at Buṣrā, were not ready to give up. They had other cities, other strongholds, and they would not surrender without a fight. The Muslims, under the leadership of Abu Ubayda, would have to be ready. They would have to be vigilant, their faith unshaken, their resolve unwavering. For the road ahead was long and fraught with danger, and only the strong would emerge victorious. With only one written line, Abu Ubayda ibn al-Jarrah could either preserve lives or invite a blood-soaked disaster. According to the reports that Al-Tabari and Ibn Kathir preserved in their histories, the decision at Emesa hinged on whether the opposing forces could accept a settlement on clear terms, or whether the Muslims would have to pay for victory with more fighting, more bodies, and more uncertainty. After the earlier clashes and the careful withdrawal that kept the Muslim army intact, the campaign's momentum moved toward a major urban prize. Emesa, a well-known city in the Syrian region, famous for its strength and its walls. The Islamic mission was not merely to defeat armies. It was to deliver a rule of justice that would outlast the campaign season. Abu Ubayda understood that the sword ends a battle, but a written settlement, and the discipline behind it, can end years of fear. When the Muslims approached Emesa, the question was stark. If Abu Ubayda rushed into a siege without settlement, the city could harden its resistance, and every day of fighting would raise the costs on both sides. If he delayed, the defenders might reinforce, or a relief force might be summoned to turn the Muslims' patience into a trap. What was at stake was not only the capture of walls and gates. It was the credibility of the Muslim promise and the protection of those inside soldiers, merchants, and ordinary residents, whose fate would depend on whether the Muslims held steadfast to justice even while they had the ability to fight. Emesa stood as a city that could not be treated like a scattered encampment. It was urban, fortified, and politically connected. Ibn al-Athir notes in his chronicle that when Muslim forces reached major strongholds, the commanders weighed direct assault against options that limited bloodshed, especially where negotiation could secure compliance without prolonging violence. Al-Tabari likewise records that the Muslim leadership, while capable in arms-preferred measured outcomes, when the chance for a lawful, binding agreement presented itself. So Abu Ubayda chose a strategy that was both tactical and moral. He pressed toward a settlement that would bind both parties. Why? Because the Muslims had learned from past encounters that a city is not simply a battlefield. It is a living system people who can be harmed needlessly if leaders ignore the long consequences of short-term victory. Abu Ubayda, acting with the sober judgment that the historians attribute to him, pursued terms that would preserve order once the fighting ended. The defenders of Emesa had their own calculations. They knew the strength of their walls and expected that the Muslim army, like any force, had limits. Horses tire, provisions thin, morale strains. Yet they also understood that the Muslims were not simply raiding. They were advancing with discipline, and discipline spreads fear differently than noise. In the Chronicles, negotiations unfold as a contest of will as much as a contest of military power. At this juncture, the narrative preserved by Al-Tabari and highlighted by Ibn Kathir turns toward the decisive moment. Abu Ubayda insisted that agreement be written, because only a written settlement could make the promise enforceable. If the terms were left vague, it would become easy for either side to claim betrayal when the pressure of the siege mounted. A verbal understanding might collapse under stress, but a document creates accountability. This was not a minor preference. It carried the weight of religious duty. The Muslims' promise must be kept. Ibn Kathir, in his recounting of these events, frames the settlement approach as part of the broader prophetic method securing rights and preventing transgression. Ibn al-Athir similarly emphasizes the seriousness with which the early commanders acted regarding treaties and the protection of inhabitants when an agreement could be reached. The crisis came when the question of speed and force returned. If the defenders refused, time would become a weapon against the Muslims. The longer the city resisted, the more difficult it would be to control the campaign's ripple effects. On the other hand, if Abu Ubayda accepted a settlement that lacked clarity, it would endanger his own side's honor and invite future disputes. The historians show that this was exactly the kind of decision that tested a commander's steadiness. He could not only win the immediate moment, he had to define the moral terms under which victory would be remembered. Abu Ubayda faced doubt in the form of real uncertainty. What would the city accept? What would the negotiation produce? And could the defenders be trusted to uphold a written promise once the pressure of the Muslims' approach increased? According to Al-Tabari's narration, such negotiations were not games. They were lifelines that could prevent escalation. And in Ibn al-Athir's compilation, the emphasis falls on the discipline of Muslim, command choosing what secures the benefit and wards off harm. There was also the political reality surrounding Emesa. City-level resistance was rarely isolated. A commander in Abu Ubaida's position had to anticipate that refusal might not be merely stubbornness. It could be a signal to gather outside help or to wait for a new phase of confrontation. Thus, the insistence on writing the settlement was more than administrative detail. It was a strategic fence. It turned a volatile standoff into a defined outcome. When the defenders finally moved toward agreement, Abu Ubayda required that the settlement be documented. That insistence is reported within the historical tradition as an embodiment of justice. What could have been taken by sword was instead structured as a covenant. The Muslims' strength was real, but their restraint was purposeful. The resolution arrived in stages. First, agreement was approached through negotiation rather than immediate assault. Then the terms were formalized into a written settlement that both sides could recognize. This approach protected the city from the chaos that usually follows prolonged fighting. It also protected the Muslims from the moral and practical consequences of breaking promises under ambiguous arrangements. In Ibn Kathir's account, the binding nature of the settlement is what allows the story to stand as a lesson. Power is meant to be governed, not unleashed. As a result, the strategic payoff was immediate and long-lasting. The city's resistance could be paused and redirected toward compliance, without the Muslims expending the resources of a siege. The inhabitants were not treated as loot by default. Rather, the terms determined how rights and obligations would be handled. In al-Tabari's reporting of this period, the Muslim advance is characterized by an insistence on order, an order that does not rely on brute force alone. Ibn al-Athir, likewise, presents such settlements as part of the method by which the early Muslims brought stability to regions they entered. But the story does not close the book. History rarely allows peace to last without testing the next hinge of events. As Emesa's settlement took shape, Abu Ubayda had to keep moving beyond the city walls in his mind, even as he honored the agreement already being drafted. For a commander, the question is never only, will the city accept, but also what comes after. The written settlement, while decisive for the present, could also create new pressures. Those opposed to Muslim authority might regroup elsewhere, those who benefited from resistance might seek revenge, and any relief effort that was delayed could attempt to strike the Muslims on the march. Thus the chapter ends on an open loop. The ink that binds the settlement is still fresh yet somewhere beyond Emesa's horizon. The next uncertainty is gathering. Who will test it first? The defenders who agreed, the forces that refused, or a new army arriving to overturn the terms? If Abu Ubayda's justice held firm in Emesa, the next trial would ask whether justice alone could keep armies at bay, or whether another confrontation would soon demand the same careful resolve, again under pressure, again with the lives of both sides hanging on the commander's choices. With only 1,500 Arab soldiers against the 30,000 Byzantine troops in the city of Antioch, Abu Ubayda ibn al-Jarrah faced an immense challenge. The city, known as the Crown of the East, was a vital stronghold in the Byzantine Empire, and its fall would significantly weaken the enemy's defenses. However, the city's inhabitants were not the only concern. The surrounding terrain was treacherous, with steep hills and narrow valleys that could easily be used to ambush the Muslim forces. Abu Ubayda had to act swiftly and strategically to secure the city and its people. The stakes were high. If Abu Ubayda failed, the Byzantine Empire would regain its strength, and the Muslim conquest of Syria would be severely hampered. The people of Antioch, already weary from years of war, would suffer further under Byzantine rule. Abu Ubayda knew that he had to find a way to secure the city, without resorting to brutal siege tactics that would harm the innocent civilians. As Ibn al-Athir recorded, Abu Ubayda was known for his mercy and strategic acumen, qualities that would be put to the test in the days to come. Abu Ubayda's first move was to send scouts to gather intelligence on the city's defenses and the morale of its inhabitants. He needed to understand the lay of the land and the strengths and weaknesses of the Byzantine forces. The scouts returned with valuable information. The city's walls were strong, but the people were divided. Some supported the Byzantines, while others were weary of their rule and saw the Muslims as potential liberators. This division presented an opportunity for Abu Ubayda to use diplomacy alongside military strategy. Abu Ubayda decided to send a delegation to the city's leaders, offering them a choice. He proposed that if the city surrendered peacefully, the Muslims would guarantee the safety of all its inhabitants, regardless of their religion. The people of Antioch would be free to practice their faith without fear of persecution. This offer was unprecedented in the annals of war, and it reflected Abu Ubayda's deep commitment to justice and mercy. As Al-Tabari reports, Abu Ubayda's message was clear: "We come not to conquer, but to liberate. We come to offer you a choice, not to impose our will." The city's leaders were taken aback by the offer. They had expected the Muslims to demand unconditional surrender and to impose their rule by force. The offer of mercy and the guarantee of religious freedom were unexpected, and it caused a rift among the city's leaders. Some were swayed by the prospect of peace and the promise of religious freedom, while others remained loyal to the Byzantine Empire and saw the offer as a trick. Abu Ubayda, however, did not waver. He knew that his offer was a gamble, but it was a calculated one. He understood that the people of Antioch were not his enemies. They were pawns in a larger game of power and conquest. By offering them a choice, he hoped to win their hearts and minds, making the city's conquest a victory for both the Muslims and the people of Antioch. The city's leaders deliberated for days, weighing the pros and cons of Abu Ubayda's offer. Meanwhile, Abu Ubayda prepared his forces for the possibility of a siege. He knew that the city's walls were strong, and a prolonged siege could lead to unnecessary loss of life. He ordered his men to dig trenches and set up defensive positions around the city, ensuring that they were ready for any eventuality. As the days turned into weeks, the tension grew. The people of Antioch watched from their walls as the Muslim forces prepared for battle. The city's leaders, torn between loyalty to the Byzantine Empire and the promise of peace and religious freedom, struggled to make a decision. According to Ibn al-Athir, Abu Ubayda's patience and mercy were put to the test during this time. He received reports of Byzantine reinforcements marching towards Antioch, but he refused to let this news sway him from his course. He knew that if he resorted to force, he would lose the trust of the people of Antioch and undermine the very principles he was fighting for. Finally, after weeks of deliberation, the city's leaders sent a message to Abu Ubayda. They accepted his offer of surrender, but with one condition. The Muslims had to guarantee the safety of all the city's inhabitants, including those who had fought against them. Abu Ubayda agreed without hesitation. He understood that this condition was a test of his commitment to mercy and justice, and he was determined to pass it. The city of Antioch surrendered to the Muslims without a single arrow being shot. The people welcomed the Muslim forces with open arms, grateful for the promise of peace and religious freedom. Abu Ubayda, true to his word, ensured that the city's inhabitants were treated with respect and dignity. He appointed a governor who was known for his justice and fairness, and he ordered his men to respect the city's holy places and the rights of its people. As the Muslims took control of Antioch, they found that the city's strategic importance was even greater than they had imagined. The city's location made it a vital link between the Muslim heartlands and the Byzantine Empire, and its conquest weakened the enemy's defenses significantly. But more importantly, the conquest of Antioch was a testament to Abu Ubayda's strategic genius and his unwavering commitment to mercy and justice. However, the Byzantine emperor was not one to give up easily. He began to rally his forces, determined to retake Antioch and crush the Muslim advance. Little did he know that Abu Ubayda was already preparing for the next challenge, his eyes set on the horizon and his heart filled with the unwavering faith of a true believer. With only 9,000 men remaining in the field after the fighting that had already consumed strength along the northern Syrian corridor, Abu Ubayda faced a question that no commander could escape. Would he bind himself to the living unity of the Muslims, or would he treat the death of their leader as permission for fragmentation? The urgency was not theoretical. It was written into the movement of armies, the mood of the frontier, and the silence that followed Medina after Umar's passing. By now, the saga of Abu Ubayda ibn al-Jarrah had already taught the Muslims a hard lesson. Conquest was not merely about taking cities. It was about holding hearts, preserving order, and keeping obedience to the rightful chain of authority. That is why the order Abu Ubayda received after Umar's death carried the weight of a test. If he chose obedience too slowly, rival commanders could claim local independence. If he obeyed too rigidly without considering the realities of distance and supply, he risked losing what he had secured by settlement, justice, and restraint. The stake was therefore double. Externally, new dangers could form wherever confusion appeared. Internally, the Ummah could fracture through competing claims, exactly what the Sahaba had feared after the Prophet's death, and exactly what the caliphs worked to prevent. Abu Ubayda, as our historians depict him, had never been the type to chase glory. His name was tied to disciplined submission, mercy with power, and the kind of courage that does not shatter the community. Al-Tabari, in his account of the events surrounding Umar's death and what followed in the Muslim order, shows how quickly the political center had to reassert itself. Ibn al-Athir likewise records the sequence of decisions after that turning point, emphasizing that authority and coordination were essential for the frontier to remain stable. And in Ibn Kathir's retelling, the same theme returns. The Muslims were not simply warriors. They were a people trained to keep their affairs in order under the caliphate. So Abu Ubayda turned from the work of negotiation to the work of command. The previous phase had taught him that Antioch and the lands around it could be governed by settlement rather than endless siege escalation. That approach had strengthened morale among both troops and locals. Now, however, the new directive from Medina demanded something that settlement alone could not guarantee: continuity of allegiance. He had conquered through discipline, but he now had to govern through timing. The strategic challenge was immediate and geographical. Abu Ubayda was not in a city where he could summon instant councils from every corner of the province. He was operating across the northern belt, where cities like Antioch functioned as hubs and where roads and passes tied the region together. The terrain itself mattered. Syrian frontiers did not forgive delay. Between garrisons, supply lines, and local power brokers, even a short vacuum could be filled by opportunists. What made the challenge sharper was that the Muslim forces were stretched. Ibn al-Athir's chronicling of campaign phases indicates that the numbers available for each decisive move were never unlimited. After the earlier fighting and after those negotiations, Abu Ubayda did not have a fresh mass army ready to march at once. He had an operational force experienced, but finite plus the administrative momentum that settlement had created. And into that reality came the order after Umar's death. Here the historian's tone becomes clear. This was not a commander deciding what he wanted. It was a commander making what he needed, while respecting what Medina required. Ibn al-Athir notes that following the caliph's death, the Muslim leadership had to be reorganized, and the frontier commanders had to receive guidance that would prevent competing intentions from forming. Al-Tabari reports the broader political developments that shaped those orders, making plain that the center's decisions were not local rumors. They were directives tied to the caliphate's legitimacy. Abu Ubayda's reasoning, as his character is shown throughout the chronicles, can be summarized in three principles that the Sunni historians repeatedly highlight in the conduct of the righteous among the commanders. First, obedience to the caliphate is part of faith in community, not merely a political convenience. Second, mercy and justice stabilize conquered lands. But stability requires an unbroken chain of authority, otherwise mercy becomes weakness in the eyes of those watching. Third, the commander must preserve the lives of Muslims while keeping the frontier protected from external threats. Thus, when the order arrived, Abu Ubayda did not respond with theatrics. He responded with order. He gathered his commanders and focused on two immediate tasks: maintaining security around the key towns and preparing the logistical framework so that the transition in leadership would not become a lull in vigilance. Because his earlier success with written settlements had shown him that careful administration can reduce friction, he favored a command posture that preserved that administrative advantage rather than inviting a new wave of violence. That is why he chose a strategy of controlled consolidation rather than an abrupt redeployment. A hasty march with insufficient numbers could turn a controlled region into a vulnerable one. A slow submission without visible coordination could encourage local instability. Abu Ubayda therefore aimed for a narrow path, to obey and coordinate with Medina while keeping the frontier intact. The rising tension came from the gap between distance and urgency. Messages did not travel instantly. Decisions had to be made without full knowledge of how far the central order had already been implemented in other theaters. Scouts and local reports might confirm one thing, uncertainty could whisper another. And in a frontier environment, rumor is as dangerous as enemy cavalry. Al-Tabari and Ibn al-Athir both convey, in their broader reporting of post-Umayyad transitions, that the Muslim state's strength depended on the timely alignment of its commanders. The chronicles underline that when unity is maintained, the frontier holds. When unity is delayed, enemies sense weakness. Yet Abu Ubayda also had to answer a question that no biography removes. Would his restraint be misunderstood? At the moment when he weighed the time it would take to confirm specific details from Medina, some voices, within any army, could be tempted to argue for independent action. Even if those voices were loyal, they could still be reckless. The temptation after a caliph's death is always the same. We are far. No one is watching. The opportunity might vanish. But Abu Ubayda, as the Sunni tradition presents him, was a man whose fear of Allah restrained his ambition. He did not treat the caliphate as distant paperwork. He treated it as the living spine of the Ummah. This is where doubt pressed hardest. Ibn Kathir, in narrating the events around the leadership transition, emphasizes that the Muslims held tight to authority. Ibn al-Athir's account repeatedly turns from battlefield detail to the governance logic, beneath it showing that the righteous leaders understood. Victory without unity does not last. Abu Ubayda faced a human pressure point. The frontier did not pause just because Medina mourned. If he waited too long, he could risk disorder. If he moved too aggressively, he could violate the spirit of the order and lose the very legitimacy that had made his earlier settlements possible. According to the historical flow described in these chronicles, the resolution was found not through improvisation, but through disciplined obedience with careful continuity. Once the order was fully understood, Abu Ubayda acted to keep the administration steady and the command structure aligned. He did not abandon the region's settlements. He did not reverse the justice-based approach that had already gained cooperation from the people. Instead, he used that existing order as a platform to integrate the frontier more smoothly into the caliphate's new phase. This is the strategic payoff. His consolidation protected manpower and maintained morale. A community that has seen mercy is less likely to revolt when the central leadership changes. A garrison that has been instructed and coordinated is less likely to fracture when the command change shifts. It is also why, in the Sunni telling, Abu Ubayda's legacy is not only in taking land, but in securing the moral meaning of landholding, to keep faith with Allah and faith with the Muslims. As Ibn al-Athir recorded the broader sequence after the leadership transition, he shows that the Muslim expansion and defense did not collapse into chaos. Al-Tabari likewise presents the transition as a matter requiring organized response across theaters. Ibn Kathir stresses that legitimacy and unity were central, so the actions of commanders like Abu Ubayda were judged not by personal initiative, but by how well they served the Umar's order. Yet history does not end on the day an order is received. The cliffhanger unanswered, and immediate was the frontier reality that no letter could fully control. While Abu Ubayda worked to keep unity and obedience intact, the northern regions remained a place where enemies could regroup, and where new forces could be drawn toward the same strategic corridors he had just stabilized. The chronicles indicate that these lands were never quiet. They were contested. Even when a city opens to settlement, the larger struggle continues beyond its gates. And now, with Medina in a new phase, every enemy watching the Muslim state would ask a question of their own. Will the Muslims remain unified, or will the distance between provinces create a window? Abu Ubayda could not ignore that the frontier always generated its own timing. His duty was to hold the line of unity long enough for the caliphate's decisions to take effect across the farthest posts. So he maintained the discipline of the men and the firmness of governance. But the next threat could arrive from any direction, from forces gathering beyond the region's known boundaries, or from shifts among local factions that had learned to wait for the next moment of confusion. And the audience listening to the Muslim chronicles would understand the open loop immediately. If unity held, the Ummah would advance with strength. If obedience faltered, even a governor chosen by justice could be surrounded by disorder. What neither Abu Ubayda nor the people of Antioch could fully know was this: whether the next enemy movement would test his consolidation the same way earlier fighting had tested it, and whether the caliphate's new orders would require a march that the frontier's stretched numbers could not easily